Hey, everybody. My name is Michael Horowitz, and welcome to this online event organized by Perry Worldhouse. I am the faculty director at Worldhouse. This is the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement. We bridge the gap between academia and the policy world, including fostering international policy engagement within and beyond the Penn community. Our work is structured in four pillars: climate change, democracy, global justice and human rights, and security. And today's event is part of our annual security conference, focused this year on artificial intelligence and international politics. As AI is reshaping the global order and offering new opportunities and challenges, how can transparency and accountability, central themes to any aspects of international cooperation, be operationalized to build trust in AI in the military and non-military domains? How can the international community ensure that AI supports rather than undermines international security? To answer these questions and many more, we're extremely excited to have with us today Amandeep Singh Gill, United Nations Undersecretary General since June 2022, and Special Envoy for Digital and Emerging Technologies since January 2025. In this role, he spearheads the Secretary General's strategic initiatives in technology, facilitates coordination across the UN system, and engages with a diverse array of stakeholders and partners globally. In recognition of his influential work in the field of artificial intelligence, Time Magazine named Mr. Gill one of the 100 most influential people in AI in 2024. Thank you, Undersecretary Gill, for being with us today, and really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for that generous introduction, and it's great to be with you virtually. And I remember some years back spoke at Perry Worldhouse at an excellent discussion that you had organized. So great to be back, even if it's virtually at the Worldhouse. So this topic that we are addressing today, AI and its interface with global politics, go to any summit. I just got back from the G20 meeting in South Africa. AI is on the agenda today. This was not so some years back. And the reasons are obvious. The monumental investments being made in AI, the excitement around it in the tech private sector space, but also the increasing recognition among policymakers and leaders about AI's implications and its enormous potential for economic growth, increase in productivity, leapfrogging, especially developing countries are excited about the leapfrogging opportunities that AI offers. But also, leaders are now aware of some of the risks that come with this very powerful technology. And those risks, of course, our day-to-day work at the UN on peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development extend across all these three pillars. And in terms of time, they go from now risks all the way to long-term risks. And policymakers are frankly unprepared for the pace and the spread of the impact of AI. And our institutions in particular, including global institutions, are also ill-prepared to handle some of these implications, especially when you bring the AI developments and their implications together with the existing challenges in the world, which is lack of trust, increasing fragmentation, the dysfunction in some of the multilateral institutions. So it's in many ways a perfect storm. So what's been happening at the UN and related forums is that for the past 3 years, there's been a discussion. And I dare say, despite the difficulties overall globally, this discussion has proceeded smoothly in a constructive frame. And that discussion has led to some concrete outcomes. And I'll just list some of them out. Just a few weeks ago, the General Assembly, all 193 member states, decided to set up 2 new institutional mechanisms: an international independent scientific panel on AI and a global dialogue on AI governance. And these mechanisms were decided in principle last year at the Summit of the Future by heads of state, heads of government meeting in New York. So the modalities have now been agreed, and the call for nominations to the scientific panel is open. And the dates are going for the dialogue, first dialogue next year in Geneva, are going to be set soon. They're likely to be in July. So those two mechanisms are in place. And a third critical piece of this emerging, budding international architecture of AI governance alongside science and policy is capacity. So concrete recommendations on capacity building. I mentioned this gap in terms of our public sector institutions, but you can imagine this gap in 90, 100 plus countries where leaders do not have 3 to 5 people that they can speak to who understand the implication of these technologies. They have virtually no compute. A country the size of Ethiopia has only 12 GPUs with which to train models that work in its own context. So there's a huge AI divide. So without capacity, governance would be hollow. So in addition to the science and policy pieces, there are some concrete options on the table for AI capacity building. These options include a global fund on AI of up to 3 billion initial investments in these 90 to 100 countries that are missing out on the AI shift. And also some other ways to kind of innovatively address the AI capacity deficit. So despite the challenges, we are moving forward. The science panel in particular would be critical to regular assessments of the state of play, of opportunities and risks. Often we are frozen between hype and horror. So we need to move forward with hope and with evidence and scientific understanding that is pooled by experts from all around the world. So it's not just one geography, one set of companies or experts who are telling us what's going on. So pooling the scientific expertise around the globe. I want to end by mentioning that this work is only a thin layer of what is needed. It's a crucial layer, but this global layer is a very thin layer, and it's not a top-down effort. It's more like you can look at these pieces as contributing global public goods so that the policy making at the national level, whether it is legislation based, executive orders based, or it is left to the courts to decide over a period of time, whatever be the choices made by sovereign jurisdictions. So this sits as a kind of a complementary layer to those sovereign choices. And finally, there is a third layer. You can think of these as sliding doors, and that is industry, private sector action. What frontier labs do on their own out of their sense of responsibility, which is where we need the private sector to engage to come up with safe, trustworthy, responsible AI innovation, collaborate with each other, learn from each other. So if these 3 layers somehow move in tandem, then I think we can realize the immense opportunity that AI offers, not only for souping up productivity and growth in mature economies, but also leapfrogging opportunities for the rest of the world. And we can handle these risks, these now risks, the medium-term risks around shifts in the job market, or in terms of skilling and education, also in terms of the potential impact on discourse, political discourse, and societal relations, and going ahead into longer term risks. Some people worry about artificial general intelligence, what that might mean for human agency, even human survival. We don't know those unknowns yet, but I think if we have these building blocks in place, if we have a collaborative multi-stakeholder approach, some collaboration was there even at the height of the Cold War, amongst the Cold War adversaries to manage some of those risks related to nuclear weapons. But I think AI is a different beast. The nuclear analogy is inappropriate in many ways, but still, I think that lesson that governments, despite different approaches, despite the competition in other arenas, need to come together to address the challenges and the opportunities of AI, that still holds true. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks so much for that introduction of the office and some of what you're doing. And I guess a place to start is the this is a good news story in a way. The United Nations member states, working together to try to build capacity and opportunities for cooperation in artificial intelligence, given the way it crosses the waterfront in some ways, or in every, it will impact every area of society, and already is in some ways over the next generation. So, what are the biggest challenges to international cooperation, on AI at the United Nations, and in particular, to put a slightly finer point on it, obviously we exist in a competitive international environment where there's a lot of uncertainty. How are you thinking about, both in your role, or how's the United Nations sort of thinking about how to transcend that, competitive international environment, whether we're talking about the U.S. and China or something else, in a way that enables some of the broader cooperation that you just told us about?
Yeah, definitely the challenges are many, and it starts with the geopolitical environment. AI is very much part of the competition among major powers. Yeah, countries know that this is immense potential, and everything is weaponized these days. The economy is weaponized, trade is weaponized, technology supply chains are weaponized. So there is this competitive spirit in a sense, and it is in some areas it's quite unhelpful. Then you have this enormous gap in terms of understanding and capacity. So you cannot, like, bring countries at very, very different levels of understanding and maturity on AI and hope for an agenda that moves fast. So you have to find ways to balance the competing priorities, as well as, the different maturity levels. Yeah. And then I would say, there is a fair degree of newness to this technology in the sense of who's involved. So the private sector is there, and these labs are not used to being part of these policy discussions. How to, I mean, we call it the multi-stakeholder approach, but that often needs to be translated into the practical work of attending meetings, contributing to policy. And sometimes, those policy discussions are unintelligent to those companies. So in a sense, we need some boundary spanners. We need some translation across these domains, and also need to finally address um, the traditional way of doing things inside multilateral forums, where not only is participation difficult for non-governmental actors, but also the policy instruments that you are used to, resolutions, treaties, etc., don't lend themselves smartly to what is needed for AI. So a lot of change, a lot of collaboration is needed. And it's been hard work getting to these points. So really kudos to some of the countries who've led on this. Sweden and Zambia on the Global Digital Compact, Spain and Costa Rica on the modalities, and many other countries who pushed for the AI capacity development work. So we would need smart uh, leaders from within the public policy space. We would need the support of academic institutions, experts, such as your university. And we would need good people from within the private sector to stretch themselves a little bit. For example, on these scientific assessments, if we do not have a way to connect with what's going on in the frontier labs, while protecting their proprietary commercial interests, then those assessments would not have the sharpness that is needed.
Mhm. No, that makes perfect sense. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is, we first met in the context of discussions about autonomous weapons, military issues surrounding artificial intelligence, and you haven't talked about that yet. And so curious if you could maybe tell us a little bit about, are these sort of challenges to cooperation, how are they similar or different in some ways in the military arena or domain versus in the non-military arena or domain?
Right. Very similar challenges in terms of the role of the private sector, the inadequacy of some of our existing instrumentalities, the current geopolitical, geoeconomic climate. But I think in the military domain, and I don't deal with it on a regular basis. That's my colleague Izumi Nakamitsu and others in the peace building and political affairs work. So I think one kind of difference is that teasing out the developments is even more difficult than in the civilian sector. And the engagement across groups, across various divides, is it needs to go up. So there are forums like the CCW where most important military actors are engaged, but others are other forums are more kind of like you had in the Cold War. You had a variety of forums, bilateral, minilateral, multilateral, looking at some of the risks and the arms control, confidence building measures type of issues. Now, we don't have yet those kind of discussions. And I'm thinking in particular of the US-China dialogue. So there have been some exchanges. Broadly speaking, discussions among nuclear weapons possessors about, what needs to be done to keep those two sets of capabilities apart, firewalling them, so there are obviously some specific challenges.
No, that's great. And I mean, my personal view is I would like to think at a minimum we should be able to agree on not letting the killer robots launch the nuclear weapons. But that might just be me. How does sorry, I think we have some. Yes, how does the Tech Envoy office manage competing interests or visions for the future of AI standards when member states disagree? You have
Yeah.
put a little more context on that. There's a big debate about AI standard setting right now, and
Right.
similar to with some countries have argued that the United States was too involved in some ways in creating the standards for the internet. Obviously, many Americans would disagree with that, and there's a lot of discussion, say, about US-China competition in the setting of AI standards. And there are, several different UN institutions and the non-governmental institutions like the IEEE that have a role to play here. How are you thinking about that and sort of managing competing interests or sort of visions for the future surrounding AI standard setting?
That's a great question. I think if we look back at what happened with the internet, it was the uh, tech community that came up with the standards. So they looked at what worked in terms of interoperability, for example, and those standards were so good in terms of engineering and design that they went viral, a term that we use today. And the success of the internet economy is largely built on those open, interoperable standards that kind of, even if they rose in the United States, they had a universal appeal to them. So in the AI space, I think we are at a stage of transition. There are multiple standards because there are, if you look at it as a stack, at the application layer, you'll have standards that interface with specific domains. Could be health, could be something else. And then you have standards around the infrastructure, which are benefiting from what has already been agreed in earlier phases of digital transformation. I think where we are, kind of need to move forward more is this middle layer where you have models, where you have, for example, these powerful AI agents that may land into applications in different areas. So how do you build them? How do you assess them for safety and performance? So different people are taking different pathways there. So it's a proliferating phase in terms of standards. So if you look at our own work at the UN ITU, International Telecommunication Union, so the standard setting work there, their kind of partner organizations in the international organization space, ISO, IEC, the SC42, the European Sentinel, the US NIST work. So you have a set of standards, and as yet there is no convergence on a kind of, let's say, here is a set of core standards that everyone kind of agrees on, as we have with the case of the internet. So it's a transition phase, and that's not a bad thing in itself. I think alongside the standards transition, we also need to look at the community transition, because AI is not technical, so it's techno-social. So how do we transition the existing community of standards developers, practitioners to this, socio-technical paradigm? That's partially capacity building as well, but also multidisciplinary research, application of standards, and so on. So at the UN, following the recommendation of the high-level advisory body on AI, we are working on an international standards exchange. There was a meeting in Delhi last year. This year, there's going to be a meeting in Seoul, where some of these standards development organizations come together and start sharing their work, because then eventually that starts to kind of getting filtered into this set of core standards, but also being more transparent with their standards work. And then all said and done, eventually, standards that work go viral. So they could come from anywhere. I think this is where you also see a bit of a race in terms of open source. For example, whose standards are going to, set the rules of the road. So I think, that's okay, but I think we need to have some collaboration and some convenings that help us to avoid these kind of tilting the floor one way or the other, and also making sure that everyone gets to work on this transformative technology as per a set of agreed standards.
No, that's really helpful, and especially the notion that the standards that are likely to win per se are going to be the ones that work the best, which makes a lot of sense. And for those that are watching, I would encourage you to start dropping questions into the Q&A. We'll open it up to the audience soon, but a couple more questions from me. One is I want to circle back to something you said in your introductory remarks about the sort of level of compute in different countries and what a disparity there is, and about the importance of inclusivity to ensure that every country around the world can access the benefits of artificial intelligence. It seems like there are a couple of different visions for how to do this. One, in some ways, would be that every country, in some ways, would have its own sovereign stack and ability to do its sort of own things. And another, you essentially would have a commercial marketplace where there might be options from some companies from some set of countries, but it wouldn't necessarily be a big deal if every country doesn't have its own sort of stack, because they have different options, and they don't need to. They can use the marketplace and access the capabilities that they need. How are you thinking about that as you think about how to prioritize different sort of visions of inclusivity in this context?
Right. No, this question was at the heart of some of the discussions inside the high-level advisory body on AI, and also during the consultations we did on the Secretary General's report on innovative financing options for AI capacity building. So compute in some parts of the world is actually, the challenge is quite acute. All of Africa has less than 1,000 GPUs. There are some on their way, but that'll take it to about 13,000 GPUs. So that's quite inadequate. And African researchers really feel the pain of not having, compute locally. So here we are not talking about the kind of sovereign stacks that countries in the Gulf or in East Asia or, US companies are building. Take Meta, for example, 250,000 GPUs. There's no comparison there. We are speaking of a minimum irreducible national capacity. Essentially, I look at it as a way to develop
talent around some use cases. So you start curating some data sets in local languages, around local problems, whether it's coffee plantation in Ethiopia, or it's public health in Nigeria, or it's orchards in South Africa. So, you start that work, but then at the same time, since you are taking perhaps models developed elsewhere, tuning them to those data sets, you're building some cross-domain talent. And I think that's critical for absorption, for growing the AI market for AI applications domestically. So I think sometimes this gets confused with, oh, you should not do sovereign AI. That's too expensive. It's not the point. But I think we need this bare minimum capacity also in terms of compute to expand the fortune at the base of the pyramid, if you will, the eventual absorption, and smooth out the demand and supply, even of compute over time. Because today you have a supply crunch. Tomorrow you may have a glut. We've seen that before. So how do you ensure that more and more researchers, more and more companies from around the world are getting into this game? At least they are learning how to drive on this highway. Not everyone is building a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, but they just need a jalopy to kind of take them from point A to point B. So I think this is the way I would look. The marketplace, I think that's a great idea. So you have compute that's lying idle in many parts of the world, university centers, for example. So if those spare idle compute cycles could be made available, even if it's, just to cover operating costs, small fees, then many researchers and companies from around the world would be very grateful for those kind of marketplaces. And this is, in fact, the idea behind the Secretary General's proposal for AI capacity building network, different centers around the world coming together, offering spare compute or, talent development opportunities, or working together on data sets. So I think this is another way to answer the competitive landscape challenge. If you kind of build these habits of collaboration around real world applications on sustainable development, for instance, that dampens that kind of, corrosive competitive spirit that, we discussed earlier.
No, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. By the way, I see that there's a hand raised. If you could drop whatever your question is into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom interface, that would be terrific. We're gonna go to questions in a minute, but one more for me for now. This is, as a student of bureaucratic politics, I feel compelled to ask about the fact that in January 2025, your office changed names from the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology to the Office of Digital and Emerging Technologies. So how did you think about that institutionally? Like, what made that kind of change necessary, and how is that helpful for generating action in the United Nations framework?
Right. So this came about after member states asked in the Global Digital Compact for a new office to help coordinate better across the UN system and follow up on the GDC, including on some of these mechanisms that I referred to earlier. So from a capacity that was kind of, created by the Secretary General, was on extra budgetary resources, we moved to a kind of a formal institution within the UN system, part of the UN organigram, a bit like, the Office of Outer Space Affairs in Vienna. So a small entity looking at a kind of a specific domain, and then, not only advising the senior leadership on what's going on. So as the SG's envoy, going to these meetings, or helping him participate in these summits, just like many tech envoys do for their own leaders, but also being a focal point, let's say a single window for stakeholders and member states to approach, because they sometimes don't have the bandwidth to go across 10 different agencies. And so whether it's advice or guidance or some kind of a way to contribute to UN discussions, so you needed that kind of an interface. Look, for me, it's as a scholar of international learning, I see this as institutional innovation, as a way to be fit for purpose. This is an area that's going to be important, is already important for a long time to come. So the UN needed to put in place a small capacity to support member states, support its own burgeoning system to get to grips with some of the implications, and also take the multi-stakeholder paradigm, which has worked very well in the case of internet governance, for example, to some of these new emerging areas. So we've seen how much the private sector appreciates that, how much independent scientists and experts appreciate that. So quite an exciting time for us at the UN, at least in this area.
No, that's great. So first question that's come in asks about the UN scientific panel and what it does essentially, and who's on it or who will be on it. And and I would add, you mentioned in particular that not to put like too fine a point on it, but that like of the two different sort of bodies, you said that the scientific panel would be especially important. And so could you say a little bit about what you envision its role being and how it will contribute to governance overall?
So this panel has not been set up yet. The call for nominations of experts to the panel, 40 experts, that is open till 31st October. So we are looking for the best and the brightest from around the world when it comes to AI and related fields. Already, I think since the call was opened on publicly by the Secretary General on 25th September, a large number of candidatures have come in. So they will be, evaluated against criteria that have been decided by member states, and a short list would be prepared, and the Secretary General will present this slate to member states, who will then decide and appoint these experts. So our hope is that this panel would come into being by the end of the year. It has a short runway because the first dialogue is likely to be in July, and the dialogue will receive the report of the panel. So it'll have about 6 months to prepare its first report. So there'll be the annual reporting to the dialogue, but then there'll also be thematic reports on specific aspects like, AI and science, or AI and sustainable development goals. The panel will decide which thematic reports it picks up every year. And at the UN, we will support this, by pooling together resources from across the system. We have some experience of supporting such discussions, whether it is in the biodiversity space or the climate change space, or you are aware of the discussions on S&T review in the BTWC context. And so there are many examples already. So we'll pool our expertise and support these discussions. I see the panel as a kind of signaling device also for governments around the world to set up their own AI scientific advisory bodies, so that they involve scientists and experts more in their policy work, and they are guided by evidence and by science. I also see this as a signal for more investments into the science of governance, the science of explainability. So it's a kind of a network mobilization modality as well. That, particularly if the panel works by engaging with experts and centers from around the world.
No, that's great. The next question focuses on some of the downsides of AI. I mean, one thing I avoided mentioning in the sort of run up or thus far has been the sort of a doomish fear that AI may kill us all. but like not to put, I mean, that's not a technical term, obviously, but certainly part of the conversation about AI has been the fear of losing control of AI in one way or another, especially as the private sector drives these capabilities forward. And you've mentioned relationships with the Frontier AI labs several times. How are you thinking about in your role the idea of AI safety in this context, given that there is this fear out there that that advances in AI could in the very worst case create like the risk of doom for humanity.
Right. Well, I mean, yes, we cannot discount these extreme risks, even though the probability may be very low. But I think we are not at a stage where AI is that powerful that it may pose some of those risks. So I don't want to speculate on when that could happen, but the current timelines are fuzzy, not clear, and I'm not even sure if the paradigm that we are in, essentially the machine learning paradigm, will get us to that place. There may be other pathways to those kind of super powerful AIs that we are not even aware of yet. So a big question mark there. But I think AI is already powerful to pose some extreme risks if it is misused, if it is deployed irresponsibly or connected to physical systems. You mentioned, strategic weapons. So, there are these kind of, um, scenarios. And I think going forward, we have to be mindful of some kind of unusual ways for us humans to do ourselves in, So like institutional weakening, whether it's societal institutions or political institutions. So, I mean, essentially, when you're speaking of doom, it is not only extinction, but it's also somehow, turning the clock back and, going back to a less developed stage, whether it is, gender relationships or societal relationships and so on. So I think we have to be careful about those kind of scenarios. And that's why regular scientific assessments are important, but also public sector involvement. I'm not taking a stance on whether you should regulate or not. There are strong views for and against, but I think you cannot abandon, jettison the public policy role in whatever form you exercise that. I think there's a space for it, and the engineers, the companies themselves have to bring in more multidisciplinary perspectives. You cannot not have AI safety teams or assessments. You need to have transparency. So labs need to collaborate. They may compete in other areas, but on these aspects, they need to work together.
So another question asks how you cooperate with other UN agencies and offices. You mentioned Undersecretary Nakamitsu already. Since AI crosses so many boundaries, not everyone uses this verbiage, but I'm often described AI as a general purpose technology. How do you stay aligned and sort of organized between sort of your offices and others at the UN? Since, I feel like almost anybody's job jar at this point probably includes something surrounding AI.
Absolutely. So I think this is something that cannot be centralized in one office. So take, for instance, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. These are existing instrumentalities we have, the international human rights treaties, some of the mechanisms that have been established, whether it's freedom of speech and expression or, children's safety, we need to leverage those. So obviously they have a strong role. One of the most important organizations in this space is the International Telecommunications Union. Its standards work, it's AI for Good meeting. In fact, the first dialogue would be back-to-back with ITU's AI for Good Summit in Geneva. UNESCO, which has done pioneering work on AI ethics. When this discussion was still at an early stages, UNESCO came out, in fact, during the pandemic, with an ethics framework that has helped many, many countries, 60 plus countries, develop their own ethical approaches, conduct readiness assessments. And then some of the sectoral organizations, like if you look at WMO, it has some of the meteorological organization, some of the best capacities within the UN system. I have been working with AI for a long time, weather modeling, climate change related predictions, some of the space work, the World Food Program, its hunger map. So it kind of uses existing conflict data sets, for example, combines with other data sets and uses AI to predict where food insecurity may break out, helps us to optimize the humanitarian response. So I think we have some interesting work ahead of us, and we need to be better coordinated. That's why this mechanism was created, so that we deliver value to member states and other stakeholders at a time when resources are scarce.
No, that's really helpful. And next question, I want to turn to something surrounding. I think I will riff it off of something you said earlier, which you mentioned open source models, and there's the release of DeepSeek's model. The Chinese company in early 2025 sent I think it's fair to say sent a shockwave through the AI community, or certainly the AI policy community, as well as parts of the technical community. And one of the things to me that was interesting about it was the way that it showed the substitutability in some ways of open source models, potentially even between different countries, as companies in different countries grappled with, oh, do I use Llama for this, or DeepSeek for that, or something like that. How are you thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of when we say open source versus understanding this is not just a binary, but a continuum in some ways. What are you thinking about the similarities and differences between open source and closed source models, and what that means in the context of trying to encourage productive international cooperation on AI?
Right. So, by the way, we organize an open source week every year at the UN. It's a new
That tells me
community
something
that's
about what you think then.
it's a new community that's coming together, but that's the kind of the classical definition of open source, digital public goods, and you have this digital public infrastructure community that has helped many countries leverage the digital transformation for financial inclusion, many other things. But in the AI context, I think open source is a shifting target. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about model weights? Are we talking about data sets? There are a number of ways in which you can think about openness in the AI context. And I think the high-level advisory body on AI had a chart that kind of tried to explain these gradients of openness and list out some of the pros and cons. Obviously, openness allows people to adapt and tune models developed elsewhere quickly. So the technology spreads faster, and there are more eyes and more hands on the keyboard in a sense. So that allows for more innovation to take place. But then there are risks, given that this technology can be misused, so particularly powerful models. So if there are no guardrails around them, they can be misused. So it's the classical proliferation problem. But where do you draw the line? I think this requires discussion, and hopefully the scientific panel would also contribute to this. I think there's been some experimentation in terms, drawing lines, whether it's compute. We saw that with the executive order during the President Biden's administration. So what I would say is that I think I would look at the DeepSeek moment as a kind of interesting turn in terms of how frontier models are built and deployed. And this has opened up many possibilities but also alerted us to a gap in terms of international collaboration on safety standards, on metrics and evaluations, and also understandings around open source. OSI, the Open Source Institute, which is in a sense, the keeper of the classical open source definition, and others who are active in this space, I think are working on these issues, and we need to have more international collaboration in terms of these common understandings and some rules. Even when things are licensed in an open way, you can always put some conditions in those licenses. So good use of open source, I think those would be. I hope I have not, kind of given you a vague answer, but just maybe to say that I think there's a great opportunity with open source and shareable models, and we should not lose that opportunity because there are some risks. And many of those risks are sometimes, not borne out by evidence from the ground. So we need some evidence in terms of where the risks are and what kind of guardrails we can put around.
No, that's great. We've got time for one more question. And the following up on what you said before, you've talked about private sector engagement a couple of times and the importance of multi-stakeholder engagement, which seems particularly important in a world where the private sector, whether we're talking about open source or closed source or whatever, is driving forward so much AI innovation. How do you, as the United Nations, how do you think about engaging private sector companies, productively and in a way that's not that's not performative and substantive. It's that's not performative and is substantive. It seems like you've made progress in this arena, and I'm curious how you're thinking about it moving forward.
I have a twofold focus on this. One is to try and include private sector players from as many parts of the world as possible, because oftentimes you only see companies from one part of the world. So getting more players from all parts of the world. And two, not only have big tech. Big tech is important, frontier labs are important, but we also need startups and smaller companies from around the world. So it was very nice to see, for instance, at the launch of the dialogue and the panel on 25th September, not only Microsoft, Anthropic, and some of these big companies from around the world, but also smaller companies like XLPAT from India, or companies from Nigeria and Kenya. So that kind of, brings some interesting insights to the room. One small company, for example, said that, we need to not only think about LLMs, but also SLMs. And they may have more of a potential in the case of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They also spoke about public procurement opportunities for some of the smaller companies. So I think this kind of diversity and balance is important. But overall, I don't think we can do AI policy, even a dialogue, without the private sector at the table. The private sector, through its daily actions, is not only creating the technology, but it's also creating the customary law, if you will, of AI governance. So we need to be able to bring them to the table, not with a view to just influencing them or being influenced by them, but I think just learning from each other. What to do, what not to do, what works, what doesn't work. So some of these mechanisms, institutions that are being created are meant to serve the private sector as well. And we need their goodwill, their participation to make them work well.
Thank you very much. I've been chatting with Amandeep Singh Gill, who's the United Nations Undersecretary General since June 2022, and more recently in January 25, the Special Envoy for Digital and Emerging Technologies. We've learned a lot from you today about international cooperation on artificial intelligence and a little bit about UN bureaucratic politics as well, which I'm secretly thrilled about. But thank you so much for joining us, and for our audience, thank you as always This will be available on our YouTube page or like all the various social media sites that you know. And we hope that you'll join us for future events, whether in person or online in the coming weeks. Thank you again, Undersecretary, and thanks to everybody for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you. Goodbye.